Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special folklore podcast round table panel. And this one is most definitely a round table for a reason, as you will have seen from the episode title for this particular episode, The Traitors, Whimsy or Witch Hunt. And that is what we are going to discuss at this round table before banishing one of the panelists and probably murdering another one overnight. So, The Traitors is a game show. It's an international game show. It's found all over the world. And joining me to discuss that game show are Professor Marion Gibson from the University of Exeter, fellow faithful, and awful, horrible traitors, Dr. Tabitha Stanmore and Tracey Norman. Welcome, everybody, to the round table discussion. Now then.
Thank you very much.
You are very welcome. Now then, we probably ought to start off this episode by describing for the three people who might be watching or listening who have not seen an episode of The Traitors anywhere, what the basic premise of this show is. And then I will describe why we are going to talk about it in the way that we are. Tracey, would you like to have a stab at defining in a small number of words how The Traitors works?
There are two opposing factions. There are the faithfuls and there are the traitors. The traitors obviously have all the power in the game because they know everything that's going on. They know who each other are. And their role is to, every night, murder one of the faithful. During the day, they will be undertaking some kind of joint challenge where they all collectively work together to raise money for the prize pot. And then later in the day, they all enter into a conflict situation where they go to the round table in order to banish one of their number. The idea being that the faithfuls rout out the traitors and get rid of them. Because at the end of the game, if there is one traitor remaining, no matter how many faithfuls have got to the very last stage, if there is one traitor remaining, that traitor takes all the money and the faithfuls leave with nothing.
So there are versions of this particular game all over the world. As I say, America has had 2 or 3 seasons, Australia, New Zealand, France, Russia, very many others. They all work slightly differently in terms of the makeup of the games and so on, but the concept is the same in every one. And you described this as routing out the traitors, and this is exactly what we are going to use as a comparison for the witch hunts of the early modern period in particular, which were very much also about routing out witches. So the whole concept here is to look at the traitors in those terms. Is it a witch hunt? Is it just a game? Do people take it seriously? How is the psychology and the dynamic of this particular show similar or dissimilar to the early modern witch hunts? Now, there are a few aspects here that we can look at, and all of my fellow panelists have submitted different ideas that they would like to discuss. Now, before we go any further, I must say we are doing this now as the UK Celebrity Traitors season is reaching a conclusion, and this is the first version where they've put celebrities in who are playing for money for charity rather than people trying to get individual gain, but the premise is still the same. There may be spoilers, so please be aware if you are listening to this that we are going to discuss past seasons of the show and the current season in the UK, which may have the odd spoiler. Okay, so bear in mind where you're watching has got to before you listen or watch this particular episode. Okay, Marion, I would like to start with you because what I would like to explore first is the look and feel of this show. And this is something that you expressed a desire to talk about So the aesthetics of the show, the way that the show operates, and particularly how the show looks, and how I guess that serves to codify for us as viewers how we are supposed to feel about what's going on screen. So talk us through your ideas here about how that works and how this compares to the witch hunts and the witch trials.
It was the aesthetics of the show that drew me to it in the first place, because I don't really like reality TV, if that's what we are to call it. So I noticed in the trailers for the show that there was the burning of a wicker man, which is always good news, in my opinion. That always means there's some folk horror stuff going on that I want to see. And there were a lot of hooded figures creeping around a castle at night, which also looked good. Burning torches, the idea of a kind of witch hunting mob appeared in my mind. And after that, I wanted to watch it. So I think there is clearly something going on. And I am talking primarily about the British version here. The other ones that I have seen elements of in Australia and New Zealand are not quite so gothic looking, but there are elements in those shows that I've seen which are similar, or at least aim to conjure up something similar. And I started to think about the ways in which that kind of iconography, that kind of imagery of history and folklore and the supernatural all came together to create a particular mood for the contestants, I suspect, but particularly, the audience. We can all see and feel that mood. And I think one of the things that it does, it presses all those buttons that Gothic novels press, or, films about witch hunting press, or horror films from the ages press. And I think those buttons are to do with fear and suspicion, kind of watchfulness, if you like, and the desire to find a villain, possibly, and eliminate a dangerous enemy. And I think all of those things are kind of inherent in the imagery, and they're projected onto the gameplay, which already has those elements waiting, if you like, to receive the elements that the imagery brings. So I was really interested in the relationship between the design of the show, the format, as Tracy described it, and the aesthetics of it, which I think in the British version particularly complement each other really interestingly, specifically for people who are interested in folklore, magic and the supernatural and history.
There's certainly more than a passing resemblance of a secret society or two about this show as well. Um, whether that is supposed to resemble, I think it has a kind of Masonic feel about it in some respects. Thinking about the design of the round table and that whole room, which has a kind of Masonic temple feel about it. The hooded
I
figures,
think so
the
too.
the kind of the plotting of these hooded figures in their tower separate from everywhere else. It has that kind
That's
of
just because cloaks look great.
sorry,
That's
Tabitha.
just because cloaks are great.
Cloaks are great. Yeah, we can't deny that that cloaks play a very important element in this. Yeah, you're right. But there's kind of something about the authority side of it and the secretive nature of that kind of resonates in that way. I think is that fair to say?
Oh, I think it's fair to say, yeah, absolutely. And it is to do with the cloaks, I think. I mean, what that conjures up for me is stuff about the Illuminati. So, this belief that over the centuries there has been a secretive sect which kind of runs the world, and in different centuries was thought to have done things like foment the French Revolution. There's that, but there's also this kind of monkish hooded thing going on, which is, a really popular image from Gothic novels, the wicked monk creeping around in the castle or monastery with his his hooded figure being glimpsed in the distance and being mistaken for other people. And this element of disguise is really important in a lot of those fictions. So I think there's that, the secret society stuff, but the Masonic stuff is particularly interesting, isn't it? And the Arthurian stuff is interesting. I noticed that in all not in all the versions, the round table is not called a round table. In some places, it's just called a banishment room or something like that. But for British viewers specifically, if you're going to say round table, everybody's going to think, oh, King Arthur. And that brings its own element of betrayal. You know, there's Arthur and Guinevere betraying Arthur in the old medieval stories, and the round table and its high ideals fall apart because of a betrayal, because of treachery in the court. And I think there's also, yeah, there's all sorts of cultural factors coming together here in a sort of wonderful mishmash. But yes, secret societies are definitely in the mix there.
And I think there's a case as well to say that a lot of people seem to refer to the traitors and the look of the traitors as being like druids. And I think you made this point
Hmm.
when you were discussing what you'd like to bring up, that a lot of people refer to them as druids. And I wonder if that has any relevance in so much as like within folklore and within kind of our ancient past, everybody seems to say that whatever it was, it's the druids what done it, you know, and whether it's good or bad, it's like if it's old and it's got some kind of link to
Mm.
folklore and folk practices, it must be druidic. It can't be anything else. And I wonder whether that kind of feeds into that whole ethos as well.
I think it does. I think there's ancient paganism stuff going on here, and especially the idea that Druids will quite happily sacrifice people in order to gain their, supposed religious aims. I'm confused about who the Druids are. It's I've seen the name come up a couple of times, and I've seen people gesturing towards some of the other hooded and masked figures and saying, "Oh, well, they're Druids." But there doesn't seem to be a specific sort of label within the show for that. I'd really like to see, what's the script? What do the producers think these figures are? What do they call them? Because some of the figures are quite clearly labeled as things like banshees, and there's a lot of talk about the banshees. And then there are these other ones, and some people have referred to them as druids. But yeah, the traitors look like druids too. And I think there's something very strong going on there about this sense of the ancient past as being tremendously dangerous, and the sense that, these people today in their civilized TV studio and, their nice comfy castle and the accommodation that they no doubt go off to every night while they wait to be murdered, they're all kind of soft, and it's sort of fluffy and safe. But then you switch to this other world, this world of the past, and there are all these people prowling around in it, whether they're Illuminati or druids, or banshees or witches. There's all this kind of supernatural danger, and I think it works really well to engage people with the show because there's that thrill of the unknown, but at the same time, we all kind of know the vocabulary. We sort of know this language, so we're looking out for it and enjoying it. I think. Well, I am anyway.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's safe to say that all of that comes together to codify the show in a particular way as to how we're expected to read what's going on. That it has this element of mystery and danger and backstabbing about it, which is exactly what the show's about. Okay, so let's drill down a little bit into the kind of mechanics of this then, and how, in particular, the psychology of this show works up against the psychology of the witch hunts, which is kind of what we're aiming at here, I guess, because there's a lot of things going on here, isn't there, which are very resonant of the way that people were accused and persecuted and hunted down as witches. So let's take some of these points. So Tabitha, well, one of the points that you made at the beginning was bias and discrimination within the show, and I guess that equates essentially to the othering of people that we see in terms of witch hunting in community. So, talk us through your ideas a little bit about how we see this idea of bias, whether it's intentional or unconscious bias, and discrimination against other people playing out.
Yeah, so this was one of the things that really struck me. I think probably struck many viewers from the very first season of the British Traitors up through to where we are now. And yeah, there seems to be a theme that people with visible disabilities or people of color tend to be some of the first to come under suspicion, I would say. At least as I say, only in I don't know about the other versions, but in the British version, that seems to be the case. And I think that's really significant, both from a kind of unconscious bias point of view, but also in relation to the witch hunts of early modern Europe. Because one of the similarities between the traitors and witch hunts is that there are very, very few clues for the people involved to be working on to identify where the problem lies. In a witch hunt, you always have misfortune as one of the early steps. Somebody gets sick unexpectedly, or somebody dies, or a ship sinks, or there's some kind of terrible thing that happens to a community, and then they cast about looking for an answer. And the same thing happens with the traitors. Everybody knows that somebody's going to get murdered. Somebody does get murdered, but there are absolutely no clues as to who it is. And I find that deeply frustrating to watch because if this was a sort of standard serial killer, for example, then there would be some clues sort of left behind. Whereas, with a witch trial, there never is. And it was recognized in the early modern period that witchcraft was often a hidden crime. It was something which was committed at distance. There was no sort of material evidence left behind at the crime scene. And so people had to look for signifiers of what could be witch-like behavior. And you see the same kind of thing coming through with the so-called facts that the faithful often look for about sort of who might be a traitor or who might not be. Unfortunately, a lot of those facts seem to land on people who are other in some way or are treated as other. And what I also find really interesting is that the facts tend to be quite spurious, but a lot of people also just say, well, I'm just going with my gut, and to me, you just feel like a traitor. And that kind of assumption that that's enough, I think is quite telling, and potentially also ties into some of the accusations that you see arising in witch hunts, because it is just that person just feels a bit iffy, or they didn't conform in the way that we expected them to. So there must be something going on with them.
I think I'd throw in here something that I was considering talking about as well, because it kind of ties into this, and that's people's believed abilities to spot a traitor, which is kind of the same as your perceived abilities to find a witch in a community in that way. So there's a very long history in this show of contestants going in who come from a law enforcement background or a security background or investigative journalism or any of these things. And every time they go into the show and in their early interviews, they say, I can tell somebody who's lying from somebody who's telling the truth because of my years in the police or because of my years as a security guard or whatever. I'm going to be an amazing traitor hunter because I can pick out. And every single time, without fail, they're the worst possible person at finding anybody who's telling even a small white lie. They're just rubbish at it. How does that compare to people who were, professing to be able to find a witch?
Marion, please help me with this one because I wasn't told, so I don't know. But
Sure.
I don't find it. Yeah.
Go
I
on,
do find
and then I'll
horrifying.
jump in. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I find it absolutely horrifying. As you say, there are so many people who clearly have, very distinguished careers in identifying potential criminals or potential troublemakers. And as you say, the fact that they're always so wrong, it doesn't give you much faith in, the legal system. um, and I'm, as I say, I feel like evidence in the real world is often there, so they have more to work on than they do within the castle or kind of the traitor's mansion or wherever they are. But yeah, it's amazing how that level of authority that they claim to have is influential, even though often their instincts are based on absolutely nothing.
It is interesting to watch people defer to them, isn't it? On the grounds that, yeah, they are, some kind of expert. And the same with psychics as well. There've been a couple of the series where there's been somebody who has claimed to be a psychic and again has spectacularly failed for at least all of the episodes that I've seen to identify the traitors correctly. But they're still deferred to, and people say, oh, well, you're the psychic or you're the police officer. We'll go along with you. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of disturbed people about the show, which was why I started noticing it. When people were comparing it to a witch hunt, they were talking a lot about herd mentality and influence and people piling on, following a leader. And I thought all that was really fascinating because it does remind me really strongly of the early modern witch hunts. You have professional witch finders in some of them, obviously, as we know. But in others, you simply have a community figure who steps forward and seems to kind of marshal the others, And there's evidence in some cases that people bring a load of witnesses to the magistrate and essentially say, well, here's my evidence, and then here are my 6 neighbours, and I've brought them along, and they will also tell you exactly why they suspect, mother so-and-so or father so-and-so and why they're a witch. So I think that's all really similar. That's one of the similarities I point to that other people have noticed too, and that they find disturbing that we tend to defer to a figure who claims knowledge, whether or not they actually have any knowledge or not. And of course, in this case, there are traitors, but in a witch hunt, there are no witches. So if you're following that authority figure blindly towards whatever it is that you think is right, the accusation of a particular person, them being taken off and tried, you're following them to nowhere. And in that sense, the traitor shows you what happened in a witch hunt, but the witch hunt is worse because there are no traitors to discover.
Okay, this segues really nicely into something that I know Tracy wants to discuss, and this does come from a different country's version. So this is from Australia. There is a notorious season of the Traitors from Australia, season 2. And it's notorious for many reasons, but particularly because of the sheer arrogance and overconfidence and ability to win out of one of the traitors, which was Sam in this scene. And Sam equals Matthew Hopkins. Tracy, discuss.
Yeah, basically, in the massive spoilers incoming now for Australian Traitors season 2. If you haven't seen it yet, A, see it, it's very good. B, pause until you have.
Yeah. But actually, in some respects, knowing what you are about to say also enhances your viewing experience of seeing just how this works out as well. So make the decision, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm partway through a second watch of Australia season 2, and it really is quite fascinating looking at it through this lens. So basically, what you have is a young man. He was 28 at the time. And he's very charismatic. He's very likable. He's very personable. He's chatty. He's confident. And he's chosen as a traitor. And right from the outset, he kind of dubs himself Sheriff Sam. And he's out to get literally everybody. He would throw anybody under a bus if it meant he was going to come out on top. So random little bit of context. At the end of the second banishment, he actually gets one of the other traitors banished. So that's incredibly early in any season for that to happen. It does eventually happen, of course. They all turn on each other at some point. But with Sam, I do see a lot of... I'm not suggesting for a second that Sam is as bad as Matthew Hopkins. It's just because of the personality traits reminding me of things which have been said about Matthew Hopkins. So, such as Matthew Hopkins was, when he started on his campaign of terror, was 25, and Sam at the time of Australia season 2 was 28. So, there's a similarity in age. And it's the persuasion factor for me that is the most similar between the two. Matthew Hopkins obviously had to persuade people that their community was full of witches and that they had to rout them out wherever they found them. And Sam's job is to persuade everybody else in the room that he is the number one faithful. And in order to do that, he sacrificed one of his fellow traitors so that he looked like the number one traitor hunter. Now, that's very different, obviously, from the way that Matthew Hopkins did it, but he again styled himself, he was the Witchfinder General. He could come into your community and cleanse it for you. And the methods of persuasion which Sam uses work in his favor repeatedly. So every day they go through their joint challenge, they meet at the round table to banish somebody, and we see the same things happening over and over and over. And yet, every time somebody has the guts to stand up and say, well, this is what I think. I think Sam is the traitor because this happened and this happened and this happened. And they lay out a airtight case, which is 100% accurate. Everybody else says, you've been very quiet up till now, and then suddenly you come out with this. Why? You must be a traitor. We must banish you immediately. And that is what happens repeatedly. And that's why I think I have shouted at the TV more during Australia 2 than at any other point in time during any of the other seasons that I've watched, because it's really difficult. It's like Tabitha was saying, there is no evidence. You are proving a negative. You're proving something that doesn't exist. It's not tangible. So if you have this charismatic person who makes himself likable, who's very approachable, who is quite happy to pretend to be anybody's best friend and anybody's support system, if it gets him what he wants, it's hardly surprising that when the crunch comes and his name is starting to be mentioned at the round table as a traitor, somehow he's always able to defend himself so well that they turn on the person who was correct and they banish that person instead. And the key thing, they do not learn from it. They do not learn from it. They do it night after night after night. And then the following day, they're full of, oh, woe is me, we're so bad at this. And I'm shouting at the TV, yes, but why are you so bad at this? It's because you are not learning from your experiences. You are just proving that, if you don't learn from history, you are fated to repeat it.
I think that charisma aspect is really important. And we obviously saw that with Hopkins as well. He was described in a similar way. And we've really just seen it in many ways as well with Jonathan Ross in the current celebrity. He's very charismatic. He's very personable. He's very humorous and obviously well liked from many years on the chat show circuit, amongst other things, And being a real fan of the show, he knew how to play the game. So he was a traitor from the beginning. And he played so well that everybody just went, I think it's Jonathan. I'm sure Jonathan's a traitor. And they all went to the round table having all gone, Jonathan's a traitor. And they all went, it's really suspicious, but you're so likable. But I still think you might be a traitor. And then they all vote for David or somebody else. It's like, and it got to the stage where we started to see memes coming out that said things like, the traitors could come to the round table and sit down in their cloaks and people would still vote out a faithful.
Yeah. One thing about community as well, in your community, this is going back to what Tabitha was saying before about clues. In your community, in the early modern period, you would have known everything about everybody in your community. You would have known the second they were doing something that was slightly out of the ordinary. And here, these people, and up to a point, I would include the celebrities, but not exactly in exactly the same way. But these people, when they're thrown together with a load of other people they do not know and have only really got a day to kind of familiarize themselves with before they have to start banishing and thinking of people as traitors. They have to create this community, this sort of temporary community, and then try to do what a normal community would do by picking on literally anything that looks slightly odd. But this is all from people they don't know. And I think certainly when I'm watching, I do forget that part, because obviously we're seeing them gelling and we see them chatting to each other, but you kind of forget that they are building this community as they go and trying to do the work of a fully established community by picking out the traitors and the people who are appearing other, from nothing.
I think that's I think that's one of the things that I find really interesting about the celebrity traitors, because as you say, with everything else, they're not a real community. They are pretending to be a community, but they're not one. But when it comes to celebrity traitors, most of the people know each other from outside, or at least know of each other from outside, and so are familiar with their personas at least. And I don't know, but I suspect that's one of the reasons that they've been so bad at identifying a traitor, because they do have that community, and they do all therefore have not just sort of unconscious biases or kind of immediately formed biases, but very cemented biases about who is expendable, or who is potentially an outsider already. And you kind of get that with the big dog theory that became a thing between, is it Jonathan Ross or is it Stephen Fry?
Just explain for people who won't have seen the UK version how that played out.
Okay, so yes, the theory was that there were most of the people in the celebrity traitors castle were big personalities anyway, but the group seemed to sort of center on the idea that Jonathan Ross and Stephen Fry were the big dogs. They were the most influential. They had the kind of the strongest kind of presence in the world outside of the castle, and so the community basically latched onto the idea that one must be a leader of the traitors and one must be the leader of the faithful, and they just couldn't let it go. And what I found really interesting was that they everybody sort of agreed that this was happening. And everybody largely agreed that Stephen Fry was probably the leader of the faithful, but then he was still the one who ended up being voted out first, and Jonathan Ross only followed afterwards. And I don't know, there almost seems to be, and this probably comes back to that charisma question, a kind of instinctive fear of actually getting it right and identifying the lead traitor, possibly in case you get targeted. But it's no, I've lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry, but it is the fact that there was this community that already existed and it was easy to kind of identify who might be the leader, I think possibly explains why they prevaricated for so long before finding a traitor. Potentially.
Could I jump in with a thing about charisma as well? Because I think you're really onto something there. That's really interesting. And the celebrity traitors are obviously a group of fairly charismatic people anyway, otherwise they wouldn't have got on in their chosen profession. And I do think that's confusing them. They are seeing each other's pleasantness and starry quality, and they're genuinely bonding with each other because these are people who are good at bonding. And I do think that is confusing them. And when you imagine that in a witch hunting community, there is this sense, isn't there, that actually charisma, emotion, it's all about feelings. Oh, I like you. I can't possibly vote you out, even though I actually think you might be guilty of something. I'm not going to turn on you. And that's fascinating to see. This isn't about reason. And that feels very strongly resonant of the witch hunts. And seeing David Olusoga there as a historian is just brilliant. They could have put him in there specifically for us. He's like our character. So great. Because he's sitting there at the table saying, well, we could try analysing this. And we could try learning from our mistakes. How did we get this so wrong? There is that sense, isn't there? They continually fail. And he's continually trying to recall them to the idea that, have you thought about analysing this? Yeah. Have you thought about thinking about why you might have been wrong? And they don't learn. And to be fair, he isn't learning either, which is particularly depressing, isn't it? It's this sense that history is being played out in front of us, but it turns out to be all about feelings and who you like and who is charismatic rather than any attempt to work strategically towards a deductive and reasonable solution, which shows you who the guilty party is.
And one difference, I think, between the American celebrity traitors and the UK celebrity traitors is that they seem to pick the American celebrity traitors, the entire cast, not just the traitors. They seem to select people who've been on other shows together and who have had massive fallings out. So in a way, the American celebrity traitors is actually more representative of an actual community where you have had conflicts. And so they kind of, sometimes they work through their conflicts or appear to, other times they don't. But with the UK celebrity traitors, we don't have any of that. In fact, we had the opposite with Alan and Paloma being really good friends. And apparently that's not the case anymore after Alan murdered Paloma. So, so apparently Paloma's taken it horribly seriously. And apparently they're not friends anymore. But I think with the I think the American one is the one for me which best replicates what an actual community would be like going into the game. Whereas the UK celebrities are, one thing they have that I don't think any other season I've seen has had is so many independent thinkers who aren't afraid to be an independent thinker. You get so many names around a round table in one sitting, as opposed to maybe 3 or 4. Sometimes you'll get 7 or 8. And that I really like that about them, but I think it's also working against them because they're not kind of coming together and saying, right, okay, are we going to vote strategically now because everything else we've tried hasn't worked? And so you're getting 1 vote for this person and 1 vote for that person and maybe 2 for that one. And of course, it's, it is an interesting factor, but I think it's working against them as well.
So there's 2 points that I wanted to pick up on what we've just been discussing there. One is to do with individuality or otherwise, as Tracy was just saying, and we'll come back to that in a moment. That's the kind of herd mentality aspect, which I think is really important. I just want to park that for a second, and go back to something else which has kind of come up in a more roundabout way, and that's greed and how that motivates people. Now, it has been said about the current season of the Celebrity Traitors in the UK that these people are playing the game better than anybody else has, and that they are playing the game because they recognize it as a game and acknowledge it as a game whilst they're playing it. Now, I think the point is that, like we were just saying, they kind of went in as friends. They didn't go in as enemies like perhaps some of the American ones have in the past. But more importantly, they are playing for charity. They're not playing for personal gain. And personal gain is a really strong motivator in the way that people behave. So how does that idea compare in terms of people's behavior in the game, but also the way that people behaved in terms of the witch hunts and what was gained or lost through that, do you think?
It lowers the stakes, doesn't it? If you're not thinking that you're going to gain anything out of it. So in that sense, the games which are played for gain by ordinary members of the public who are going to get a lot of money at the end of this if they play it well are much more like witch hunts, it seems to me. And they are kind of nastier. I mean, the first British season was actually quite nice. People were quite nice to each other. The second one was a bit of an eye-opener because actually people were very willing to betray each other in really quite deep and intimate ways. And that left a bit of a sour taste in the mouth at the end. But that actually felt to me more like a witch hunt because there was it had real edge to it. And there was a lot to gain. What you would gain from a witch hunt would be a solution to your personal problems or an explanation for that horrible tragedy that happened to you. It would make sense to you. The world would make sense to you once you got rid of your enemy. But, you know, when if you're playing it as a game, it is different. It feels different. You can see some of the same psychological things going on, but it's not illuminating in quite the same way because they are actually really good humoured about it
And in fact,
on the whole.
that second season goes back to what Tabitha was saying at the beginning as well, about othering and disability and so on, because the winner of that second season, Harry, was in the final, with a girl. Remind me of her name.
Molly.
Molly. Thank you, Molly, who was physically disabled. Not that that had a bearing on the way that the voting went or anything like that, at least not consciously. But she invested everything personally in Harry because she was so firmly of the belief that he was faithful and they were going to split the money and it was all going to be happily ever after. And then in the final, turns out he's a traitor and she is absolutely devastated by that. And I think even when it got to the kind of the post series kind of bringing all the cast back together for a nice chat show that you always get at the ends of these, I got the impression that things were still slightly frayed and strained between the two of them at that point.
It
Yeah.
would certainly make sense. Yeah, I didn't see that, but the way that she reacted was genuinely upsetting, wasn't it?
Mm.
You know,
Yeah,
she
it
kind
was
of,
life-changing, wasn't it? I mean, she
it
literally
was.
her yeah, and I think that's the thing, you know, between the celebrity traitors and sort of the normal traitors is that it is a game in that nobody's actually being murdered, but it is also real. You know, that their lives, if they win, will not be the same as when they started, you know, so it isn't just a game for them. And I think that that sense of betrayal that a lot of them feel when they either get voted out or they get murdered, and especially after they've discovered who they were murdered by, I think also very much sort of speaks to what would be going on in a community that was afraid of witches. Kind of the idea that you had been betrayed by one of your neighbors and they had cursed your child or had cursed you, and the bitterness that would be involved in that and the inability to move past that and how that would sour relations for years, and then eventually potentially end up in a formal accusation. I think that you really see how visceral this the sense of disappointment and hurt can be for people who have only just met each other. So imagine that you've lived beside somebody for 30 years and then you get accused by them as a witch, or you think they are sort of practicing witchcraft. It's so intense, and extremely human, disturbingly human, actually.
It's a bit like the Alan and Paloma thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So with Alan and Paloma, they've been friends for a long time, so they're the sort of established community versus Harry and Molly, who met on the Traitors. And then at the last round table, if I remember rightly, Molly actually at one point wrote Harry's name down on her board, but then she crossed it out and changed it to somebody else.
She couldn't
So
bring
she
herself to do it, could
No,
she?
she couldn't. She believed so deeply that he was a faithful that even when there were suspicions about him and very well described suspicions, she was almost there. And then at the last minute, she changed her vote, and that was the change which basically ruined her game.
Okay, that kind of leads us back into the other point that I parked just now, then only in a slightly kind of smaller way, and that's the herd mentality aspect. And this is something that obviously relates very strongly to the witch hunts as well. The herd mentality of one person makes an accusation, and everybody else jumps on board and follows that train of thought, perhaps with very little evidence, if any, to go on. And we see this coming up time and again in different iterations, different seasons of this show, that particularly when you've got a large number of players near the beginning, a good traitor just needs to be a sheepdog, because they are essentially just rounding up all the other people and putting them exactly where they want them. And there was one particular series. It was either the first season of Australia or New Zealand. I can't remember which, but I think it was New Zealand, where it got to like 3 or 4 episodes from the end, and that herd mentality had played all the way through. Nobody had their own trains of thought. They all just grouped together, and it didn't serve them very well at all. And there's a real similarity there, isn't there, with that kind of community accusation and people grouping together and ganging up on people like that.
And I also think that when we were talking about the established community versus the traitor created community, you're when you see people like in Australia, there's Camille, who used to be a federal agent, and there was Keith, who used to be an undercover police officer. Neither of them let that information out. Camille was telling everybody she was a stay-at-home mum, and Keith was like, "Are you really?" But because they didn't want their past to cloud how they were seen in the game. And there's two particular groups for me who always get a rough deal. The first group is the people who are quieter at the beginning when there's a big group of people, either because, they're a bit shy, or they're not a big personality, or they're naturally somebody who listens first and talks later after they've learned something. And they are always about halfway through the people who start to get targeted, because then they have more opportunity to speak up. The other group, which gets a rough deal, is actors. We've just seen Mark Bonner being booted off because he happened to play a particular part. We have seen Guyton in Australia, who also plays, I think he plays a cop. And they got rid of him because they thought, you're a prize-winning actor, you're an award-winning actor, so therefore you must be a really good liar. And he's saying, well, yeah, I can create a character when I've got a script and some guidance and some rehearsal, but this is real life, I'm just being me. So there's those two groups who always get a rough deal, as does anybody from one of the other reality shows where you have had to have some element of deception.
Yeah. And also it's when that information comes to light, like you say, that things can change. So there was a girl in one of the UK seasons who was an actress. She hid the fact that she was an actress. She was only a bit part actress. She'd done a few episodes of EastEnders and a couple of other things. Nobody would have recognized her from anybody else. And she was quite safe right up until the point where, for whatever reason it was, she told people that she was an actress, and within a couple of episodes of that, she was gone.
I think that this is not a perfect comparison, but I think that sort of latching on to one particular detail or some kind of sort of pre-game bias about like your assumptions about who a person is based on what they've done in the past, or any kind of mention of their family or their kind of their career or anything. It does link to some of the people accused of witchcraft in the Hopkins witch trials, but also other witch trials, in that so many accusers mention the fact that the accused witches' parents were also witches or thought to be witches.
Yeah,
and that idea that you must have some of that knowledge that's been passed down, or you're carrying that taint. And it's amazing how salient that piece of evidence is, despite the fact that that shouldn't really be admissible in a court of law as a reason. But yeah, that's.
The other thing that I was thinking of whilst I was doing my rewatch of Australia is the role of the host. So, we've got Claudia. The Australian season has Alan Cumming, who is worth watching for his wardrobe alone. And, oh God, I can't remember his name, Roger in the Australian season. And the role of the host is a bit like the interrogator, because they are there to they're there to mock the faithfuls for being crap at finding traitors and praise the traitors for being good at killing faithfuls. And so they're kind of stirring the pot and setting up these conflict situations and putting these two factions in opposition to each other and kind of constantly needling every morning at breakfast. Oh, you've let another faithful go. You're a bit crap at this, aren't you? You really need to get better at this. Otherwise, you're all going to be dead. And, the traitors are laughing at you. You're making their job so easy. And again, it's another angle from which the conflict and the uncertainty and the discomfort that the players must be feeling about the decisions they're making, it comes from the host as well.
Because of course they've
nice.
chosen the traitors in the first place, and
Yeah.
they always refer to them in that way, my traitors.
It makes them sound a bit like a minister or a preacher,
Yes.
actually, in early modern England, because they spent a lot of time in sermons and the prefaces to witchcraft trial treatises saying the witches are laughing at you. You've allowed the devil to take over your nation. What are you thinking? Wake up. That's really interesting. And the thing you were saying about who is noisy and who is quiet has made me think too, because we often say, quite rightly, I think, that the people who are stereotypically accused of witchcraft are often among the noisier members of their community. They've quarrelled with neighbours, they've spoken out in some way, they've been noticed in some way. Maybe they've been accused of scolding or barratry or quarrelling or something like that. And that's definitely true in a lot of cases, but it does make me think about the absence of evidence of quietness, if you like. There's no way of proving that some of the people were actually, law-abiding people minding their own business, who perhaps had to speak up in some new context and were noticed for the first time. There's no way of proving that in history because they would not have left a record of their quietness. But it makes me think about that stereotype that the noisy people always get accused, the tall poppy syndrome, if you like.
And this
it's a lack of conformity as well, isn't it? It's the need for conformity. And if you put your head above the parapet, you're not falling in line with what's expected of you, are you?
And this herd mentality as well feeds into something a point that Tabitha made, which is that people seem to have an inbuilt fear of accusing in a lot of ways as well. So and that can often backfire on them later. But for some reason, they will not accuse. So they kind of come up with reasons why they can't do it. I need to gather more evidence first before I can make an accusation.
Yeah, I think that so my partner always uses the phrase when he's watching the Traitors, if you're going to go for the quick king, you better not miss. But it doesn't actually apply in this game. Why does it matter if you miss? That there is always enough opportunity to vote them out later, and there is very little they could do apart from potentially murder you, but they could do that anyway. I think it's really fascinating, this idea that I'm pretty certain they're a traitor, but no, I need to not upset them until I'm really sure and I've got enough support. But they're very happy to just throw faithfuls under the bus, and they do that every single night. Possibly because they seem less of a threat almost, and kind of it's easier to take down somebody who doesn't seem threatening than it is somebody who does seem threatening.
Yeah, I mean, Sam actually said at one point in one of his little mini interviews, his friends survive. Everybody who goes against him are the ones who get murdered, and he has no idea how the other faithfuls fail to see that. And it's almost like they reset, isn't it? They get into the round table and they sit around that table, and it's almost like almost everything that's happened before has gone, and they're just focusing on what's happened that day. I can't remember which series it was, but that was somebody actually said that, I think, at one of the round tables, that they're not taking into account everything that has happened before, and that they did exactly the same thing again.
Well, we were sort of discussing this, weren't we, before we started recording, about the kind of the very sort of high tension environment that the round table represents, and how
Yes.
similar that is to a trial sort of courtroom. And sort of it's they do. I sort of said, if they were able to sort of go off at different points during the day and just sort of vote individually secretly, then would we have a different result than in this incredibly kind of toxic, febrile thing where you can just sort of throw a bomb in the goldfish bowl, and everything blows up and people just stop thinking for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. Mark, did you find, was it you that said they are sometimes around the round table for a good couple of hours and we only see the edited highlights?
That's what I read. I mean, I can't back that up as solid fact, but that is what I have heard say
Yes, I
about
didn't
it.
realise that.
But also, it's worth bearing in mind, and I was going to say this has no impact on the witch hunts, but I'm going to wait for Marion and Tabitha to call me out on this and say that I'm wrong. The round table is very heavily edited. So we only see extracts of what people are saying, yes, but also we see reaction shots that there is no guarantee that that reaction shot is a reaction to what that person has actually said. So people say something like, oh, somebody accused Jonathan, and then Jonathan looked so shocked. And it's like, yeah, but that reaction might have come from an hour previously, and they've cut that in because they want to paint a particular picture for you. I was going to say that doesn't have a direct bearing, but maybe I'm very much wrong there.
That's interesting. I mean, that's really interesting. A lot of the time, the evidence that we have of a witch trial is, of course, not real-time courtroom testimony. It's actually the statements that people made before they went to court, sometimes months before, when they were either accusing somebody or they were responding to an accusation, the reaction shot. That's really, really interesting. So actually, in a sense, you do get that kind of misrepresentation. And if they're printed, for example, in a witchcraft pamphlet, the reader is being manipulated in just the same way that the viewer is being manipulated into thinking, wow, I'm actually seeing a verbatim account of a trial. This is amazing. This is like photographic evidence of a witch trial. I'm there, I'm in the moment. But of course you're not. And the historian isn't either. And that's really interesting.
Well, history's contested, right? History is contested.
Apparently, yes.
We can only go on what has been written down and whether it has been written down correctly or incorrectly, and what has been not written down or left out of those records.
And when it was
well.
written down
yes,
too, as you say.
Yeah.
And the biases of the person who wrote it down.
Yeah. But and we've talked about bias already. There's a great thesis in the making here for somebody, There really is. I can see a lot of potential here. So we've
I have something. Sorry, I have something about the challenges.
I was just going to lead into this actually.
Okay.
I was just going to say we've talked a lot about the round table, but we haven't particularly discussed the challenges. So, yes, Tracy, throw your challenge-based point in, and then there's some other things we can look at here, I think, too.
Yeah, one of the things that occurred to me was challenges kind of, for me, represent the testing of an accused, because they are whisked away. They don't know where they're going. They're told, wear this, but they have no idea what they're going to face. They're given an enigmatic clue after breakfast by the host, and then they start speculating about, oh God, is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? But they don't know what they're going to face until they get there and have the explanation given to them. And that kind of made me think of how an accused would undoubtedly have known the kinds of things that had happened to other accused in the past, but were those going to happen to them? They did not know what they were going to face when they got to jail, and whether they would be searched or whether they would be floated or whatever would happen to them. And it kind of reminded me about that aspect of it. So the challenges for me represent kind of the testing that would have happened, and the fact that they didn't know what they were heading into. So I kind of drew a bit of a parallel there.
That's really nice, because often how they perform in a challenge is later used as part of the discussion about whether or not they are a traitor or not. So people at the round table will say, well, so-and-so did really well in the challenge, you know, that perhaps they behaved bravely or unselfishly or whatever.
Or Nick and Joe.
Yes, or they
and the chess
cheated.
challenge.
Yes, and that is held against them later on, or it counts in their favour.
Yeah.
And we also saw this with the rope bridge challenge from the last episode, where every person who successfully crossed the rope bridge, the person to whom they had to throw the sack that they had collected on the way, who then had to go and choose who would, get a shield from everybody. Without fail, they all chose the person who had crossed the bridge because they were brave enough to cross the bridge. But the second and third person, I suspect, only chose that person because that's what the first person had done. And it would have looked really suspicious if they hadn't followed suit, even if they secretly wanted to choose themselves or another member of the group. They felt they couldn't.
The only time I think somebody's actually behaved badly in a challenge and hasn't been sanctioned for it by the group was in the American celebrity traitors, where Kate, who was one of the reality TV people, decided she didn't really like the challenge and didn't want to run around collecting bags of money. And so everybody else was scrambling around trying to collect as many sacks of cash as they could. And she was throwing them away and not pulling her weight and sort of basically bratting, and even though she was doing that, she didn't actually get any kind of sanction from the group. I mean, it was mentioned obviously, but I think it was quite a while before she got voted off, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was. And I think that just came down to the fact that in those American series, half of the contestants were reality TV people, and the other half were normal people, for want of a better term. And I think that just came down to, well, it's Kate and everybody knows what she's like, and it's just her bratty character, and it's obviously an on-screen persona, and she's not really like that, and we don't know what she's really like, obviously. But yeah, she got away with it. So the other aspect of the challenge is something that Tabitha has brought up as another point, which is that they're collaborative, right, and they're trust-based, and everybody is working at a team. And that kind of resembles the way that communities had to work together in the early modern period at particular times of the year, harvest time, and pulling together when there's sickness in a community and all of those kinds of things as well. So there's a kind of a parallel there, isn't there, as well, between you have to be a part of the community, whatever your feelings are in that sense, because you will stand out and you will therefore be othered for it if you're not. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. And I think that, as you were saying, the fact that pulling together in one of the challenges is treated as evidence of being a faithful is kind of reminiscent of how much we do trust people who help us, even though every traitor is as motivated to win as much money for the prize pot as possible as any faithful is. People still go, oh, well, they did work really hard and they were really brave. And that shouldn't be any evidence at all. But you can imagine how that sort of thing would also play out in a community if you were, as you say, at harvest time, or in a very kind of dangerous environment like the childbirthing room, and you have the entire village of all the women of the village kind of descending on the birthing room to kind of help somebody through. Then somebody who's not involved or doesn't behave particularly well in that environment would probably very quickly be othered, or at least have some kind of suspicions around them. And there's even a case of a woman who was accused of witchcraft in Cambridgeshire in the 1640s, and she she actually confesses to witchcraft, as many in the Hopkins witch trials did, because of the use of the interrogation methods. But the reason that she gives for cursing somebody is because she wasn't invited to the post-harvest celebration that was being held at another woman's house. And so that kind of that community bonding is so important in the early modern period. But also kind of not being involved in it immediately marks you out. And you can kind of see that same code being played out in the Traitors, even though there's no reason why the Traitors wouldn't be involved in the community activity.
Okay. So before I ask one final question, has anybody got anything that has come to mind during that discussion that we haven't covered that they want to throw in as another parallel or another interesting talking point?
One thing that, a couple of things actually, that Kate said in one of the last episodes that we watched of the UK celebrity traitors. She said, you can't trust your gut anymore because it's lying to you. And they can't trust each other because they're lying to each other. And when before we were recording, we were talking about the way that they come to the table with their theory, which is 100%, they're 100% certain that X is a traitor. And then the second they're questioned about that, they back down, and sometimes they will change their vote. And it's a bit like the way that, you know, you pack up to go on holiday and you start off on your drive to your destination, and then one of you will ask the other, did we lock the back door? And you were certain you did, right up to the moment when you're questioned. And I think it's that kind of self-doubt, because they've got so little to go on facts wise, like we were saying before. But also, are we as humans inherently full of self-doubt? And that's what we keep seeing coming out. And is that one of the contributing factors to both the mess that the faithfuls make around the round table sometimes, and also the mess that was made with all the witch hunts?
There are lots of game shows that employ psychology, but I think the Traitors is the cleverest and most difficult to play and most difficult to get right and get the result you want out of any of them. And there are a lot of aspects of cultural life that employ psychology and are difficult to get the responses and the results that you want from them. But arguably the witch hunts and that period of history really do fit into that category. So for me, I think these parallels are actually really strong, aren't they, between the two?
They do feel strong, don't they? I mean, obviously there are dissimilarities that we've surfaced as well, but I think overall people are right to compare this to a witch trial. And I hope, you always hope people are going to find something in that will allow them to learn and move on and stop witch hunting people and stop scapegoating people. I'm sure that won't happen because the lesson of the show is that we don't stop doing that. But I think they're right to say this is like a witch trial.
Yeah, absolutely. But theoretically in a safe environment, although I'm not even sure in some respects that that's always the case either, but at least in a very carefully monitored and very carefully controlled environment that has people there for other people's welfare and to monitor what's going on. And we see that in the credits for the show. We know that that happens, so that's slightly different. One final question, and it's not, are you a faithful or a traitor? I did toy with the idea, but it's not that. It's a different question. And I don't think the answer to this, at least in my mind, I don't think it's as straightforward as I thought it was going to be when I formulated this question. As far as the traitors is concerned, who are the witches? Are they the traitors? Or are they the faithful? Or does it depend on how you carry yourself as to how you are seen?
That's nice. Yeah.
I
mean, go on.
Well, I'm gonna break the question a bit. I'm sorry. I don't think there are any witches. I don't think. I think there are a lot of witch hunters.
Mm.
And some are professional witch hunters, which I would say are the traitors, and then you have the faithful who are the community witch hunters.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
No,
Because otherwise you would have to see the traitors as witches, and certainly they have the iconography of witches. You know, they're like in the traitors' tarot. There are three of them around what looks like a kind of table or could be a cauldron, and they're hooded and they're like the witches in Macbeth, and you know all that kind of all those images are going through your head, but they genuinely are guilty. Whereas the witches of the witch trials were not guilty or not guilty of the things that they were said to be guilty of. They may have practiced magic, they may have cursed people, etc., but we do not believe on the whole that their magic actually worked. So yeah, there are no witches, there are traitors, just as in communist witch hunts there were communists and so on. There are no witches though in the witch trials, so that does
and
make the question harder, doesn't it?
it does. And yet, I would argue it brings us full circle to how we opened this discussion with your point, Marion. There are no witches, but there are three people in cloaks who are codified to resemble that.
Yes, and must be hunted down accordingly.
Yeah. Fascinating, isn't it? It really is. We'll need to wrap it up there for no reason other than in 25 minutes, as we are recording this, the next episode of this will be broadcast and we need to be there to see what happens next. So we will leave it at that point. Whether you were indeed a faithful or a traitor, I thank you all, Marion, Tabitha, and Tracy, for being part of this particular traitorish round table. Thank you.